reaching the maximum yields in corn and soybeans through weed management. Here to explain about that is Jami Loecker. She is the West Heartland Agronomy Manager for Syngenta in the United States, and she will tell us about the 10 commandments of weed management to reach those high yields. Right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. So, Jamie, thanks for being here on the program. I would like to start introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks so much for having me, Louise. Glad to tell you about my background. I grew up in a rural community in Kansas, which is in the central part of the U.S. And in that community, it's a very farming centralized community. So, I had family members that farmed. My dad specifically was a crop consultant in the area. And I spent a lot of time riding around with my dad and looking at crops and listening to him make recommendations for crop protection products, fertilizers, seed hybrid variety selections, things like that. So got my interest in agriculture at a very early age. I was active in our national FFA organization or local FFA organization as a high school student. I worked locally at our research farm that was sponsored by Kansas State University. So I got to see the research side of the agriculture industry then through kind of my high school and early college years as I was working to get my education. And then once I finished college at K-State, I graduated with my master's degree in soil science. I went to work for Syngenta, and I started with Syngenta on the seed side of their business. So I was a seed advisor manager for about 4.5 years for Golden Harvest, and at the time still part of Garst. I transitioned to the crop protection business and was a crop protection sales rep for about 2.5 years before becoming an agronomist for the crop protection side of our business. And then last June, recently took the agronomy service manager for the West Heartland. That West Heartland geography is essentially the Midwest part of the US. So if we think about Minnesota, part of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and part of Colorado would be the general area that's covered in that space. And within that area, we've got about 10 agronomists that service the sales reps and also the local retail partners that we work with, and then growers that we have relationships with in that area as well.
And what about your role? What is your role about?
Yeah, so the 10 agronomists that are in that geography, I work with them to collaborate and help kind of drive direction in what we need to be doing from a training perspective. So a lot of the work that we do does focus on training for our crop protection products and general agronomics within our own sales team, and then also with the retailers and the growers that we work with. We are also responsible for making sure that we've got the right trials put into place to help demonstrate the benefits of the crop protection products that we promote in that area. And really, we focus a lot on driving grower solutions. So, trying to figure out an all encompassing way to approach the challenges that the growers have in that area is really a key priority for us. And we want to make sure that what we recommend is responsible, that it's also economical, and that provides a benefit to the grower, especially through yield production. So, we believe that the importance of raising more bushels is really how folks, growers, will find themselves in a more prosperous opportunity versus, some of the competitors that we are in the market against or position against would promote maybe practices of trying to quote unquote save folks money and not necessarily putting them into the best agronomic recommendation.
So let's jump into the commandment. The days that weed management is just about spraying glyphosate are over. So what would be the first commandment? And please tell us a little bit why is so the weed management is so important.
Yeah, the first commandment really focuses on knowing your weeds in your field. And so it's in general, we talk about understanding your key driver weed species and knowing how to manage them based on their life cycles and general practices in the area. So a few things that come to mind for me. Certain weeds are easier to kill at certain times of their life cycle versus another. So they might be more easily killed during the seedling stage versus, say, a reproductive stage. In addition, you've got to know when those weeds are going to be emerging. And if they emerge early, say in the springtime, prior to us planting any of our crops, we've got to make sure that we're out there early enough to stop those weeds from continuing to develop and make sure that they don't end up competing with our crops. So sometimes that means that we're out well ahead of the crop being planted versus waiting to make any kind of in-season applications. A couple really great examples that come to mind. One is mare's tail. It's a weed that we deal with a lot, especially in our no-till acres in the Midwest. And that's one that will emerge either in the fall or early in the spring. And if it bolts and starts to get any height to it prior to us terminating it, it can be very difficult to kill. So being early is important. Another part of knowing your weeds is really understanding what kind of herbicide resistance challenges you actually have in that field. So if, for example, you have glyphosate resistant water hemp, it's important to know that so that you know how to manage it accordingly without glyphosate or without attributing control to glyphosate, and what other products you would need to incorporate into that. So knowing your weeds is incredibly important.
Okay, and what about those producers that are worried about the costs to do the weed management?
Yeah, I think the cost of a herbicide program always needs to be a consideration for a grower. We can't just say, don't worry about it, just make this application and go on with it. But what we often don't figure in is the cost of not implementing a herbicide program that is going to drive the results that we're looking for. So, anytime we have weeds competing with the crop, those weeds are taking light, nutrients, and moisture. And that's light, nutrients, and moisture that the crop should be accessing and not weeds. And so it doesn't take sometimes more than a couple dollars of a more expensive herbicide program to deliver weed control that is going to give a grower, say, maybe 2, 3, 4, and 5 bushel better yield at the end of the year. That is a much better outcome from a cost perspective when you think about it. And then in addition to that, what's the cost of not managing those weeds, exposing them to post-emerge herbicide applications, and increasing the likelihood of developing more resistance issues. So it's very costly for us to not manage the herbicide or the weeds with a proper herbicide program.
Yes, and every farmer knows what crops reward better, but they should keep in mind that they should do crop rotation. Why is that?
Yeah, crop rotation really adds diversity to our programs. And there's always some specific herbicides that we can use in one crop segment that are not allowed in another crop segment. So it does give us the opportunity to have some crop rotation when it comes to herbicide management. And then also just from a spectrum of diversity. It might be the difference of implementing some kind of a different practice, whether that be planting date based on the different crop that we're utilizing. Maybe it's a tillage application based on the different crop that you're looking at. Just changing things up helps us keep the weeds kind of on their toes and prevent them from continuing to evolve in a way that makes them accustomed to the practices of a monoculture cropping system.
Yes, and another thing that would be important to rotate are the herbicides. So, what do you need to have in mind to select your herbicides?
Yeah, it's when we come to the concept of rotating herbicides, herbicide rotation is important, and that is a huge reason why crop rotation is important. But with that being said, rotating our herbicides really doesn't provide value unless we are rotating to herbicides that are effective on our key driver weed species. So we've got to make sure that the different products that we plan on using, being in a different site of action group, is also still effective on whether it be Palmer amaranth or water hemp or giant ragweed that we're targeting. We want to make sure that it is going to be effective, because it really does a grower no good to take one herbicide that they're using that's working and for the sake of rotation move to a different herbicide that doesn't work. So we've just got to be really cognizant when we do that herbicide rotation that we are rotating to something that is also effective. And the thought about herbicide rotation would be that we're rotating sites of action to expose the weed to something different that it hasn't seen last year or the year before. And honestly, it's becoming more challenging as we see more resistance issues crop up, and there's less and less new herbicides and new sites of action being introduced. We've got to be really thoughtful in how we implement a herbicide rotation strategy.
And what exactly are the multiple effective sites?
Yeah, so for me, this is almost more important than the second commandment that you just mentioned a second ago, which was the herbicide rotation. But the multiple effective sites of action really has to be used in conjunction with that changing or the rotation of our sites. So more importantly than rotating the sites is that we do use more than one active ingredient that is active on a specific site of action and a different site of action that's effective on that driver weed species. So that's a mouthful right there. But essentially what we want is at least 2 to 3 active ingredients in a herbicide premix that's going to be effective on your driver weed species that acts on a different site in that plant. And this is really important to reduce the likelihood of selecting for resistance in plants. And this will keep our tools that are in the toolbox viable for a much longer term and be more sustainable.
And usually, after planting and spraying, farmers scout their fields. So, why is that so important, and what should growers look for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first off, if we think about the Syngenta portfolio, I think Acuron is a really great example. Acuron herbicide has 4 active ingredients. We've got 3 effective sites of action in that product. So it's everything I was just talking about from an effective site of action perspective. And with it being such a robust herbicide, as a company, we say we want to make sure that we stand behind that product and that we service it as needed. And so if a grower were to have problems with that herbicide application, we need to know about it as quickly as possible so we can help evaluate what's going wrong in the field and what needs to be done to make some changes or adjustments to make sure that we get ahead of those weeds that are coming up. So for example, a residual herbicide, anybody's residual herbicides, not just Syngenta's, needs to be activated. You've got to have rainfall that puts that product into soil solution where it's available for uptake by the weeds. And if we don't get that rain activation, then we're not going to have the weed control we were looking for. And you might have escapes or weeds cropping up into the field sooner than what would have been expected. So we've got to evaluate what's happening out there. We need to understand why. And we also need to know our options for gaining control and making sure that we don't have those weeds competing with the crop, robbing it of that light, nutrients, and moisture that will take away from the yield at the end of the season. And the sooner you know that, the better, really.
And what farmers should have in mind for the following season?
Yeah, there's a few things to think about. So number one, it would be what crop do they plan on rotating to? What were their previous herbicides that they used? And are there any potential rotation challenges or issues that they need to be aware of? And then what programs would they plan on implementing that next season? So can they rotate different sites of action with their chemistries? How will they best be able to implement that multiple effective site of action strategy? Another couple things that I like to think about too is what can we do to help that crop be more competitive. So for example, if we're thinking about soybeans, utilizing a high quality seed care product like Cruiser Max Vibrance is going to allow those beans to come out of the ground faster and get to canopy sooner. And if we can get that crop to canopy sooner, it can take some of the heavy lifting off of the herbicide program that's being utilized.
Yes, let's talk about the post-emergent applications. Why timing is so important in that part of the process, and why is that so critical?
Yeah, so I love that question. And part of the reason I like that question so much is because it allows us to talk about the key resistance management strategy of overlapping our effective sites of action. So when we look at our own Syngenta data, and we also look at some of the work that universities have done, and even competitive folks in the industry, when we look at research on what sets us up for the best yield opportunities, it's always a two-pass herbicide program. And so the idea would be is that we achieve solid weed control ahead of the crop emergence, and that we come and we overlap another effective site of action, multiple effective sites of action in an early post application to make sure that there's not a gap in weed control there. So the less weeds we keep from coming up, the less that that crop has to compete with any kind of escapes that might come into the place. So if we can reduce the impact of that competition, we can improve the yield at the end of the season. So if we wait too long, that's going to allow those weeds to start germinating, and then we've got to subject them to a post application. Now, we do have some good alternatives or some good options to make sure that we do burn down some of those weeds. But the fewer that we have to expose to a post-emerge application, and then also the smaller the weed size that we can target, the better. If those weeds start to get larger, they're going to be more potentially tolerant to the herbicide application that we're making. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're resistant. It just means that they're more capable of metabolizing what we're exposing them to. But nevertheless, we don't want to increase the likelihood of missing any of those in season. Once you've hit them post-emerge, those weeds are going to be more and more difficult to control in subsequent applications. And they're likely still going to produce some seed, even if it's not very much. They're going to figure out a way to finish out their life cycle, and it's going to cause you problems in the season after that.
And those weeds that are tougher to control, what other cultural practice can you add?
Yeah, so there's a few different things that we do from a cultural practice perspective. One would be is implementing tillage where that makes sense and that's the right decision. In a lot of the Midwest and a lot of the West Heartland, we're utilizing no-till cropping systems, which has been very effective. It helps us save on moisture. So in areas where we're really dry, it helps us retain some of that moisture. And then also, if we can have cover on the ground, it will almost somewhat mulch the ground in some scenarios to protect us from some weed emergence. However, there are times that tillage is really the best way to take out some of those difficult to control weeds that have came up that are more tolerant to the herbicides that we're using. Another cultural practice that we consider at times would be cover cropping. So if you've got another crop out there to essentially compete or to reduce the likelihood of having those weeds emerge, it can kind of hold them at bay until you're ready to put in your next crop or the actual cash crop that you're looking at utilizing. A couple other considerations that folks really should think about, and that comes back a little bit to that seed care comment that I made just a minute ago, is what can we do to get the best start with the corn and the soybeans so that they can get to canopy as absolutely quickly as possible, whether that be through a correct seed treatment or through hybrid and variety selection. Those are important considerations to make, especially when you think about the different environments that you're planting into, and maybe even like what some of the key pests and pathogens are that crop is likely to experience early in the season.
Yes, and commandment 9 is to have clean equipment, especially during the harvest. Why is that so important?
Yeah, I think that's one that folks probably haven't thought a whole lot about previously. But we do know that one of the quickest and easiest ways to transfer herbicide resistance would be seed via, say, their tillage equipment or the combine, right? So if you've been working in a field, or let's say you've recently started farming a new piece of ground that you haven't been managing, so maybe there hasn't been as robust of a herbicide program on that farm as what most of your acres have experienced. There could be some different populations out there that have different herbicide resistance issues. And as soon as you're out there running the combine through that field, you will collect some of that seed in the combine. And the next field that you go to, inevitably, you will transfer some of that seed to that location. So the better you can clean off that equipment prior to moving, you're reducing your likelihood of spreading herbicide tolerant traits in your weeds. Additionally, any kind of pests that might be transferred via soil or dust, things like that. I think about like nematode issues. Any cleaning that we can do prior from one field to the next is going to help us keep our fields more clean.
And finally, what's the cost of poor weed management?
Yeah, the cost of poor weed management. The list gets fairly long, right? So when we think about those weeds that are competing with the crop, we know that nutrients is a major factor, right? Some of our research has shown that, weeds as small as 2 to 3 inches tall could take 9 pounds of nitrogen, for example. We know that a 3-inch weed in 3 days is going to take an inch of water. And in a lot of our geography, water is a very valuable natural resource, and we oftentimes lack it during certain times of the year. So we really can't afford to be losing any of that moisture to the weeds versus putting it into the crop. Um, Anytime that we have that competition, we are taking away yield from the crop. We're potentially causing additional problems for us later in the season and also for the years following. So it's really hard to put an overall price tag on that cost of poor weed control. But what we do know is that can cause a lot of headache moving forward as well. We sometimes will do unnatural things when we've had poor weed control. We come out and we try to maybe make some rescue treatments. So let's say, for example, I mentioned earlier that if we get that gap in our pre and post emerge herbicide application and we have weeds emerge that are either tolerant to our herbicides post emerge that we're using, or they get too large and we miss them, then we're coming back in with another application. So we're using another herbicide that's going to cost us X amount of dollars. And we've got another application fee that's going to cost us X amount of dollars. And a lot of times that can be circumvented just by being more timely and thoughtful on some of the product choices that we're making. So, if we can get that second pass of an Acuron herbicide on early post before those weeds come up, we've activated it in the soil, we've reduced the likelihood of having to come back again and again, trying to essentially salvage the investment that we've already got out in the field.
Yes, and taking advantage of your knowledge here, what the soybean and corn growers should have in mind when they choose a herbicide.
Yeah, I think some of the most important things for folks to have in mind if they're growing corn and soybeans is number one, what is the best way for me to manage the weeds in a way that's going to deliver the multiple effective sites of action to the target weed species in a way that will be effective. So, there's a number of different options out there available. One of the ways that they can consider is selecting a really robust premix herbicide that delivers multiple effective sites of action into one product. Soybeans has become a very complicated space from a herbicide decision spectrum because there's so many different traits out there. The soybean growers have to determine which trait platform they want to move forward with, but nevertheless, they still need the residual herbicides to ensure that they're going to get overall really good weed control. So, we have a number of different products like Prefix and Sequence, which would allow us to get a residual in the soil. Those herbicides are going to provide us that blanket benefit of having the control in the ground, And then also, we have great tank mix flexibility with a number of our residual herbicides that we could incorporate into the auxin systems or even the Liberty Link system, so that we can get some of that burn down activity on the weeds post-emerge when we have to, but continue to recharge the soil with a residual herbicide. Um, if folks do have more questions, they can visit www.syngenta.com or talk to their local Syngenta representative, and we would be glad to help identify any areas where maybe there's some misses or some additional solutions that we could bring forward for them.
We are really thankful for you being here, Jami, sharing all of this information. We really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Luis. I really appreciate this opportunity.